Thank you so much for attending my PowerPoint presentation on every argument for atheism explained and debunked. The science has replaced God argument. Science explains things. Lightning is electrical discharge. Disease is microbial. The cosmos assembled itself from a singularity roughly 13.8 billion years ago. God, according to this argument, is a placeholder, a god of the gaps, crammed into whatever science hasn't explained yet. And the gaps keep closing. Pierre-Simon Laplace, when asked by Napoleon why his celestial mechanics made no mention of God, reportedly said he had no need of that hypothesis. The atheist's favorite quote since 1802. Here is the problem. Science explains mechanisms. It does not explain why there is anything to have mechanisms at all. How did the universe expand is a different question from why does something exist rather than nothing. That second question does not fit in a test tube. It never has. Also, Georges Lemaitre, the Catholic priest who actually proposed the Big Bang, presumably did not experience a crisis of faith upon finishing his own math. Francis Collins ran the Human Genome Project and still goes to church. Scientists are, it turns out, allowed to do both. Next up is the more specific version of this argument, which is that Darwin personally killed God, the biological evolution argument. In 1802, William Paley made the following observation: if you find a watch on the ground, you infer a watchmaker. You do not assume the watch assembled itself. Applied to biology, the argument is straightforward. Living organisms are staggeringly complex, therefore a designer exists. Richard Dawkins spent an entire book explaining why Paley was wrong. Natural selection operating over deep time produces the appearance of design without any designer. Blind process. No intent. No watchmaker. Just mutation, selection, and roughly 3.8 billion years of iteration. Fine. Accept all of that completely. Evolution still does not explain why there is life to evolve in the first place. Abiogenesis, the origin of the first self-replicating molecule from non-living chemistry, remains an open and genuinely contested scientific question. Darwin's theory begins after life already exists. Whatever happened before that is, at the moment, nobody's department. Furthermore, evolution requires a universe already configured with the precise physical constants, atomic bonding properties, and planetary conditions necessary for chemistry to produce biology. The dials were set before the first cell divided. Who set the dials is a question evolution does not answer, because evolution does not go back that far. The Catholic Church officially accepted evolution in 1950. Kenneth Miller, the biologist who testified against intelligent design in Kitzmiller versus Dover, is a practicing Catholic. The argument proves God did not hand sculpt every beetle individually. That is all it proves. Next, we examine whether God is a competent engineer. The argument from poor design. The recurrent laryngeal nerve starts in the brain, needs to reach the larynx, and in a giraffe takes a 15-foot detour down the neck, loops around the aorta, and climbs back up. Nobody is defending this. It is genuinely one of the dumbest roots in vertebrate anatomy, and it exists because evolution works by modifying existing structures rather than redesigning from scratch. Stephen Jay Gould made the same point about the panda's thumb, which is not a thumb at all, but a repurposed wrist bone doing a thumb's job at roughly 60% efficiency. The human spine was designed for quadrupeds and is now load-bearing vertical weight it was never meant to carry. The birth canal is too narrow for the skull that has to pass through it. 99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct. If this is intelligent design, the designer has a tolerance for failure that would get any engineer fired. Here is the problem with the argument. Suboptimal is not the same as undesigned. Engineers working under constraints produce suboptimal solutions constantly. The argument also assumes we know what God's design criteria are. If the goal is physical efficiency, the giraffe nerve is an embarrassment. If the goal involves something other than physical efficiency, the criteria shift, and suddenly you are not qualified to grade the exam. Additionally, at the biochemical level, Michael Behe points to the blood clotting cascade as a system where the components are irreducibly interdependent. The design argument cuts both directions. The giraffe nerve is bad. The fine-tuning of the cosmological constants is not. We'll be moving on now. The burden of proof argument. In 1952, Bertrand Russell proposed the following. If he were to claim that a small china teapot orbits the sun somewhere between Earth and Mars, nobody could disprove it. But the inability to disprove it does not make it reasonable to to believe. The burden of proof sits with the person making the claim. Applied to theology, God is the teapot. Theists are making the extraordinary claim. Atheism is simply the absence of belief in the extraordinary claim. An absence of evidence, where evidence should be expected, is itself evidence of absence. Antony Flew formalized this in 1976 as the presumption of atheism. Start from zero, prove it or don't. The teapot analogy works perfectly if God and a teapot are the same kind of thing. They are not. A teapot is a contingent physical object that either exists or doesn't in a specific location. God, in classical theism, is a metaphysically necessary being, the ground of existence itself, not one more item in the universe that needs a postage address. Comparing them is a category error wearing an analogy costume. Furthermore, the argument assumes theism offers no evidence. The Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning of physical constants, the hard problem of consciousness, and the existence of objective moral facts are all presented as positive evidence by serious philosophers. You do not have to find them convincing. You do have to acknowledge they exist. Antony Flew, the man who wrote The Presumption of Atheism, became a deist in 2004. He concluded the fine-tuning evidence had shifted the burden back. The teapot, it turns out, was not the final word. Next, we examine whether God can't even keep his story straight across civilizations. The argument from inconsistent revelations. There are roughly 4,200 religions currently active on Earth. They contradict each other on nearly every meaningful claim. Allah is not, Yahweh is not, Brahma is not the Tao, at least not in the way each respective tradition understands their own deity. If God exists and genuinely wants to be known, the result should not look like this. It should look considerably more consistent. Instead, what we observe is that religious belief correlates strongly with geography and birth culture. Born in 7th century Arabia, you are Muslim. Born in 1st century Judea, you are Jewish. Born in contemporary Utah, the probability distribution shifts considerably. This suggests religion is a social phenomenon transmitted by culture, not a divine signal transmitted by God. The argument has a structural problem. The existence of contradictory claims about X does not prove X does not exist. It proves that people disagree about X. Contradictory scientific theories about the origin of the universe have existed throughout history. That did not make the universe disappear. At most, the argument establishes that the majority of religious traditions cannot all be simultaneously correct. That is not the same as establishing that none of them are. The geographic correlation argument is also doing something philosophers call the genetic fallacy. The origin of a belief does not determine its truth value. You almost certainly believe in evolution partly because of when and where you were educated. That does not make evolution false. John Hick proposed that all major religions are valid responses to the same ultimate reality. Every tradition he said this to rejected it immediately. Next, the argument gets personal. The argument from non-belief. Theodore Drange formalized this in 1998. The logic runs as follows. If God exists, and if God wants people to believe in him, and if that belief is necessary for whatever relational or salvific benefit God intends, then sincere, reasonable, non-resistant, non-believers should not exist. But they do. People who genuinely want to believe, who have no psychological resistance to the idea, who have examined the evidence honestly and simply cannot get there. Their existence, Drange argues, is itself evidence against a God who desires relationship with all people. This is distinct from willful rejection. This is the person who tried and came up empty. The first problem is the premise that God's goal is universal belief. That is a theological assumption embedded in the argument, as though it were a neutral observation. Classical theism generally holds that God's goal is freely chosen relationship, not belief as an intellectual conclusion. These are different targets. A God optimizing for genuine love rather than cognitive assent might reasonably operate differently than the argument expects. The second problem is the category of non-resistant non-belief itself. Augustine wrote that the human heart is restless until it rests in God. Theists generally contest whether genuine, sustained, non-resistant openness to God's existence routinely goes permanently unmet. That is an empirical claim dressed as a self-evident observation. Michael Murray adds that epistemic distance from God may itself serve human dignity. Coerced belief, or belief made unavoidable by overwhelming evidence, is not the kind of belief that constitutes a free relationship. The argument is essentially, I looked and didn't find him, which is either the most honest argument on this list or the beginning of a longer conversation. Moving on to the argument that makes the same point with considerably more philosophical firepower. The argument from from divine hiddenness. J. L. Schellenberg published this argument in 1993 and has spent the decades since refining it. The structure is clean. A perfectly loving God would ensure that anyone not resistant to a relationship with God would be able to have one. Conscious, genuine relationship requires awareness of the other party, but non-resistant non-belief exists, historically and at scale, including entire populations who lived and died without meaningful access to the concept. Therefore, a perfectly loving God does not exist. Schellenberg is careful to distinguish this from the problem of evil. He is not talking about suffering, he is talking about love. A perfectly loving human parent does not hide from their child. A perfectly loving God, who is also omnipotent, has no logistical excuse for the same behavior. The counter arguments are serious and worth taking seriously. Paul Moser argues that God's hiddenness is deliberate, designed to cultivate volitional trust rather than intellectual acknowledgement. God, on this account, is not interested in being detected. He is interested in being chosen. Those are different projects. Daniel Howard Snyder raises a more fundamental objection. The concept of perfect love, when applied to an infinite being, may not map cleanly onto human relational categories. What perfect love requires of an omniscient, omnipotent, necessarily existing God may be genuinely different from what it requires of a parent. The hiddenness of God is also, notably, a theme internal to the Abrahamic traditions themselves. Deus absconditus, the dark night of the soul, in John of the Cross. Psalm 22 opens with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The tradition was aware of the problem before Schellenberg was born. The fact that the best available response is essentially love works differently at infinite scale should tell you something about the difficulty of the question. Next, we talk about evil. The problem of evil, Epicurus formulated this roughly 2,300 years ago. If God is willing to prevent evil but not able, he is not omnipotent. If he is able but not willing, he is malevolent. If both willing and able, evil should not exist. If neither, why call him God at all? J.L. Mackey sharpened this into a logical argument in 1955. The existence of evil and the existence of an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God are logically incompatible. William Rowe offered an evidential version in 1979. Even if the logical problem can be resolved, the sheer quantity and gratuitousness of suffering makes God's existence improbable. A fawn dying slowly in a forest fire, it cannot escape. A child with terminal cancer, suffering that produces no discernible good for anyone. Rowe calls this gratuitous evil and argues that a good God would eliminate. Alvin Plantinga's free will defense is widely considered to have neutralized Mackey's logical version. God cannot create genuinely free beings and simultaneously guarantee they choose good. Freedom and guaranteed outcomes are incompatible. Most philosophers now concede the logical problem of evil is not decisive. The evidential version is harder. John Hick's soul-making theodicy argues suffering is the necessary mechanism for moral and spiritual development. This handles human suffering with some plausibility. It handles a fawn dying alone in a forest fire considerably less well. Skeptical theism responds that our cognitive limitations prevent us from judging any suffering as truly gratuitous. We cannot see the full picture. Stephen Wickstra calls this the problem of cornea. We are not in a position to say that if God had a reason, we would know it. The deeper problem is that the argument borrows moral categories. Evil is bad and should be stopped, that are genuinely difficult to ground without God in the first place. Dostoevsky noticed this in 1880. It has not gotten easier since. This argument has occupied theologians for 2 millennia. You encountered it as a caption on a photo of a sad dog. Moving on, the Euthyphro dilemma. Plato wrote this dialogue around 399 BC. Socrates encounters a man named Euthyphro outside an Athenian court. Euthyphro is about to prosecute his own father for impiety. Socrates asks him to define piety. Euthyphro says piety is whatever the gods love. Socrates proceeds to dismantle him completely in public, which was something Socrates did. The core question that emerged has outlasted both of them by roughly 2,400 years. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? Horn 1. If something is good simply because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary. God could command torture genocide, or the systematic suffering of innocents, and those things would become morally good by definition. The Holocaust would be ethical if God had ordered it. Most people find this uncomfortable, as they should. Horn 2. If God commands things because they are independently good, then goodness exists as a standard outside of and above God. God becomes a moral messenger rather than a moral foundation. Atheists can access that independent standard directly, rendering God unnecessary for ethics. The standard theological response since Aquinas is that both horns rest on a false dichotomy. God does not choose the good from a menu of external options, nor does he arbitrarily invent it. God is the good. His nature just is the standard of moral perfection, necessarily and eternal. What God commands flows from what God is, not from a separate decision process. Divine simplicity holds that God's will and God's nature are identical. The two horns collapse into each other. William of Ockham did hold the voluntarist position that God's commands constitute morality by fiat. He is a minority position in classical theology, and the dilemma is most often aimed at a view that mainstream theism never actually endorsed. Plato wrote this to humiliate a man prosecuting his own father. It has since been used to humiliate God. Both targets have proven more resilient than expected. Last argument. This one involves rocks. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it? If yes, there exists a rock God cannot lift. Therefore, God is not omnipotent. If no, there exists a thing God cannot create. Therefore, God is not omnipotent. Either way, omnipotence is self-defeating. The concept is logically incoherent. A logically incoherent God cannot exist. This argument has been the go-to philosophical gotcha since the medieval period. It is also the argument most likely to appear in a YouTube comment section, a freshman philosophy seminar, and a conversation at a party where someone has had exactly enough drinks to feel confident about metaphysics. Aquinas answered this in the 13th century. The answer has not meaningfully changed since. Omnipotence in classical theism does not mean the ability to do anything, including logical contradictions. It means the ability to do anything that is logically possible. A square circle is not a thing that exists in any coherent sense. It is a combination of words that describes nothing. Asking whether God can create one is not a profound challenge to divine power. It is a malformed question wearing the costume of a paradox. The rock paradox works the same way. A rock too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift is not a coherent object. The description contains a hidden contradiction. George Mavrodes made this point formally in 1963 in the journal Mind. C.S. Lewis made it less formally, but more memorably. Nonsense does not cease to be nonsense simply because you put the words God can in front of it. God's inability to make 2 + 2 = 5 is not a limitation on God. It is a limitation on the question. Alvin Plantinga adds that the ability to create a stone one cannot lift is not a great-making property. Its absence does not diminish God in any meaningful sense, for the same reason that the inability to draw a four-sided triangle does not diminish a geometer. The paradox has survived for centuries not because it is unresolved, but because it is entertaining. Like the appendix, it is vestigial, serves no real function, and occasionally causes inflammation at dinner parties. In conclusion, these arguments represent the sharpest philosophical challenges humanity has produced against theism, and you should absolutely engage with them. If you enjoyed this PowerPoint presentation, I made others, and you should absolutely check them out. Peace on planet Earth.